Canasacca. And that's what got me interested in cyanobacteria, because about 7 years ago, my husband, who's over back there, we bought, yeah, he's a driver. Yeah, we're turning this into a date day, yeah. So, but we bought this beautiful little seasonal camp. I call it a cottage, he calls it a camp, but it's on the Lake Canasacca in Moultonborough. And we love it there. I mean, just imagine how much we love being, you know, on Tucker Pond. And beautiful, clear water, wonderful people. But 2 summers ago, we had a cyanobacteria bloom, and it was the full, you know, lake-wide. The lake was green, like pea soup. And later, that happened like early August, and then we started having localized blooms on certain shores and coves. And then the same thing happened last year. We didn't have the lake-wide green thing, but we had blooms that really went on from August until November. So the first year, we were just, everybody on the lake was just horrified, as I'm sure you know the feeling. And so we organized and we put together a special committee, an ad hoc committee, to study about whether we should go forward on a watershed management plan. And that was something that the board of the Lake Canasacca Watershed Association had been thinking about, but they're expensive. They're like $70,000 to $80,000 to have one of these things done. So I was on the ad hoc committee. We recommended to move forward. We recommended to go with Forest Bell, FB Environmental, and we raised the money. We went to the town of Moultonborough with the petition warrant article, had them fund about 2/3 of it, and then we raised the rest. And going through this process made me realize, how do small lakes do this? Because that's a lot of money to raise. But yet these are state-controlled water bodies, and shouldn't the state have some role in protecting the lake? And I thought, well, hey, I'm a state representative. You know, I can do something, right? So I met with people from DES, from New Hampshire Lakes, and I said, we need to put together a broad-based group of people to really look at this. And I modeled the initial bill, 1066, after another commission called HB 737 Commission, which looks at PFAS, the impact of PFAS to the environment and health. Because in my town of Merrimack, we have had a massive groundwater contamination from Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics. And we have twice the rate of kidney renal cancer. So this commission, 737, was part of legislation that passed in 2019. And I chair that commission, and we've been very successful getting legislative and non-legislative remedies recommended and passed in order to address that issue. So I thought, well, let's take that model and use it for cyanobacteria. So what happens in the legislative sausage making process, because that's what it is you know, a representative or a senator comes up with what's called an LSR. It's a legislative service request. And it's just a declaration that we want this bill. There's an outcome we want from the legislature. So we work with attorneys in legislative services, and then they put it into a bill called, you know, in its number, it was called 1066. And it was assigned, because I'm a House member, it's assigned to a House committee that the bill then goes to, and they hold a public hearing. And they hear from key stakeholders, lobbyists, people that are pro, people that are against it. And the committee will ask questions, and sometimes there's an amendment to that bill. And it's mainly to address concerns that may not have been understood well at the beginning. Amendment may be to make it more politically attractive, to get votes. So when it went before the House Resources, Recreation, and Development Committee, The chairman, Andy Renzullo, and another representative wanted to amend it so instead of having a commission look at this issue, it would just put a mandate on DES to solve the problem, okay, to come up with a plan, which is great. But those that really understand cyanobacteria, it's a problem that you have to manage. It's not something that you're really going to get a permanent cure for, although there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'll go into that later. So they amended it to just make this mandate. And to be honest with you, I was a little bit upset about that because they didn't ask me about the amendment. They just brought it forward. That's okay. But I felt it was really important to get broad representation because I've worked with DES on many other issues. I have tremendous respect for many of the people in DES, but it's a bureaucracy. They're very under a lot of political pressure from the governor. They don't have a lot of money, and it's like, it's gonna, and legislation that really bothers me is legislation that you think is solving a problem. So it gives people a false sense of accomplishment, but it really doesn't do anything. And that's how I felt that bill was going to end up. But it, as amended, it passed the House committee unanimously, and it passed the House unanimously. Now it goes over to the Senate, where the process is replicated. It's assigned to a Senate committee. And then it goes to the Senate floor. Now, when it goes to the Senate committee, there's a senator, he wasn't on that committee, but Senator Jay Kahn, he's from the western part of the state. And he lives on a pond outside Spofford that has suffered a lot of cyanobacteria. And when he saw the bill come over to the Senate, he called me and he said, "Tell me more about 1066. What do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's okay, but I really wish it had broad representation. For example, I don't know about Tucker Pond, but I know with Lake Kennesaca, if we have a bloom, it's really hard notifying people. There's other stakeholder groups that, DES could come up with some strategies on cyanobacteria, but it's not going to solve the problem. DOT has a stake in this. Veterinary Society has a stake in this just because they need to help recognize cyanotoxins when pets are brought in. I mean, there's just an array of people that are impacted with blooms outside of what I felt was DES's sphere of awareness. So he amended the bill in the Senate to add a advisory committee and also to add some money that DES had initially requested to do a literature search so that they could hit the ground running with the work that they were going to do. They also wanted to adjust some of the timing. They felt some of the timing expectations wasn't realistic. So Senator Kahn amended it in the Senate. That passed, and then it passed the Senate floor. And now it's awaiting the governor's signature. So every day I check, and he hasn't signed it yet, but I don't know. I've learned in the legislature, don't ever say no brainer or because you just never know. But I'm hopeful that he does sign it.
Should we be writing to him?
It doesn't really matter. He's at the point, he did ask, there's a new person at the state, Kate Hastings, who's in charge of the harmful algal program. She replaced Dr. Amanda McQuaid. You may have been working with her.
Yes.
Amanda's gone to UNH, and Kate's her replacement. Kate's a wonderful person. She's only been on the job maybe 3 weeks, so but I think she's doing a great job for only being, here she came from UNH, but she was asked by the governor's office to provide two sentences on this bill. So. I think he's, however convincing her little notice was to him, I think will help determine if it's going to pass. But it had tremendous public support, way beyond my imagination. I was really happy. As soon as people learned about the bill, I was getting calls all the time. Even people outside New Hampshire. And I tell people this is the biggest issue in my opinion, one of the biggest. Housing's one, there's a couple issues, but this is one of the biggest issues facing our state that no one knows about. And I know in Lake Canassack, so anyway, so I've developed these relationships. One person is David Niels. He's the chief aquatic biologist for the state. And we went out together with Amy Smagula, she works for him. She's in charge of the aquatic invasive species program. But we went out on Nippo Lake a couple weeks ago I helped them do some sampling. Nippo Lake is the second lake in New Hampshire to receive an alum treatment. And why it's important for the state to really understand and get experience with that is alum treatments are probably going to be recommended for a lot of water bodies in New Hampshire who have suffered chronic cyanobacteria blooms. And Lake Canassack is one of them. We have a watershed management plan that FB Environmental just completed. It's got some finishing touches, but we presented it to our Watershed Association last week. And it identified the sources of phosphorus that are going into our lake that we need to mitigate. A big chunk comes from erosion and runoff. Those are things we can control. Another source is septic systems, old septic systems that have failed and that are leaching nutrients into the lake. Other sources are waterfowl droppings. I forget the other one, but one of the major sources that we have that's right up there with shoreline erosion and runoff is internal loading. And I don't know if you're familiar with what internal loading is, but it's phosphorus that's added from the lake sediment. And what's happened with climate change is that our winters are warmer. They don't get as cold at night as they used to. And they're shorter, so we have earlier ice outs, and we have later ice ins. So the temperature of the water is also in the spring is warming faster at an earlier date. And what's happening is that it's the water at the bottom of the lake isn't turning over completely with that at the top. The water layer at the top is warming up fast enough that it's stratifying with other layers of water layers. And when I went out to Nippo Lake, it's clear that there's 3 layers of water. And when this mixing doesn't happen because climate change has caused this earlier warming of the top layer, so it just kind of interacts by itself. There might be a second layer it might interact with, but the bottom layer of water is not moving, it's not being mixed in, and it's becoming anoxic, very low in oxygen. And what happens is that in the bottom of the lake, there might be just old leaves, maybe dead fish, whatever. But as that decomposition is occurring, it's consuming oxygen. And it's not getting new oxygenated water because of this stratification. And when the oxygen level gets low, the pH drops, okay? In Nippo Lake, it was around 5.5 pH, and that's pretty low, that's acidic. And our sediment in New Hampshire is naturally high in iron and manganese. And natural phosphorus that's found in nature binds to oxygen and binds to manganese, and even aluminum that's found naturally. But under low pH, low oxygen levels, that phosphorus becomes released. The bond is not strong enough to hold under those circumstances. So that phosphorus goes into the water column and it feeds cyanobacteria. Mm-hmm. So I hope everybody was able to follow that little mini chemistry lesson. So that's called internal loading. And there's really no way to control that. So even if Lake Canassack, even if we got rid of all the runoff, we fixed all the septic systems, fixed the erosion, if we did everything right, we would still have high phosphorus because of this internal loading. Now, there are many ways to to stop that. One of the most common ways and most economical ways, even though it's not that economical, but of all the options, is called an alum treatment. And alum is aluminum sulfate. And, I've used it in cooking before. I think I've used it in pickling. But what they do is they spread alum on the lake. It goes down, and because it's heavy, and when it goes down, it grabs phosphorus. And then it settles on the bottom, and then it absorbs into the sediment. And the phosphorus aluminum bond is strong. It can withstand that low oxygen, lower pH of water. And it usually will last for anywhere from 10 years up to 20 or more than 20 years. It depends on, disruption of the sediment and things like that. You still have to control the external loading, but the alum treatment will stop. And it's done a great job in Nippo Lake. They noticed within days. It's like over 3 days, their treatment. It cleared the lake. And it's been absorbed into the sediment, and it's doing a great job. And so getting back to 1066, so DES is going to be using Nippo Lake, the learnings they have from that, plus what's going on throughout the world, because this cyanobacteria is a global problem, because climate change is a global problem, and there's been lakes all over the world, and many in the United States who've had this treatment. New Hampshire's just kind of lagging because we've been able to keep our temperatures colder than, let's say, Florida or the Carolinas. So 1066 will allow DES to really understand this and put a plan together for a more strategic plan to address runoff from roads, expand their rulemaking, and I can kind of go into specifics of that, but also to, I guess, justify alum treatment as a standard procedure for chronic cyanobacteria bloomed lakes. So it's really important. 1066 is going to give a lot of attention. It's going to provide resources and research and data to DES to develop a comprehensive plan on addressing this. What I've talked to David Niels about is also a bill that I'm going to introduce in September, which would set up a $25 million cyanobacteria fund that small lakes and ponds, things that are still under the state, large enough to be under the state control, where lake associations or other organizations can borrow from, or it can provide matching funds to conduct watershed management planning, to do alum treatments, or to do projects that are identified in a watershed management plan that are necessary to reduce phosphorus loading. It's going to be modeled after the milfoil fund. Some of you are familiar with that. The state has a fund about that size that communities can use to help provide some funding to remove aquatic invasive species. So it's going to be that same type of model, because to leave cyanobacteria up to small associations really isn't doing justice, because it takes a lot of time, and the more chronic cyanobacteria blooms become, the harder they are to get rid of, because with internal loading, you're just pumping this phosphorus into a lake. So every year it's going to get worse. So anyway, but I know I've gone on kind of long, but I hope that gives you some background. Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Uh-huh.
I was curious, with alum treatment, how many years or decades has it been used, and is there any unintentional consequences?
It's a good question. I was at when we presented our watershed management plan last week to the members of the Lake Canasaka Watershed Association. A woman asked about that, and Laura Deemer from FB Environmental Associates said that no, there isn't any negative effects of it as long as the lake is dosed properly. Before an alum treatment is approved by the state of New Hampshire, there's a lot of tests that have to be done. They have to measure phosphorus at every level and around throughout the lake to know how much alum is just necessary to bring that level down. But they haven't seen any effects with any aquatic wildlife. But one of the things Laura said that really struck me is that the health impacts of not doing anything are far greater, because the cyanotoxins from cyanobacteria have been linked to neurological diseases in humans and in animals. In fact, the first bloom we had 2 years ago, there was a puppy that got very, very ill, almost died. And then he didn't file it, but the president of our association, his dog did die. And he never really found out directly, but he'd been playing in the water, and then the next morning they found him dead. So, when you weigh the risks of not doing anything and the risks of doing something, it's clear that alum treatment is a very reasonable, sensible approach. And it's been done, I think, well over 1,000 lakes in the U.S. without any issue. Yes.
Thank you for putting together or pushing 1066 forward and the new thing. A number of us here sent in emails supporting it.
That.
And yeah, very strongly support the original bill that you had put forward. That was certainly the best version of it. I think going forward, it would be great if you might think in terms that alum treatment is not a standard, not a generalizable version. So we've had we've discussed internal loading a lot at the Cyano Committee here. We've had a consultant, Don Kretschmer, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, Don's great. And he sampled the bottom of the lake and found that there is very little phosphorus in the bottom of our lake.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And there's lots of free aluminum.
Yeah.
So dumping more aluminum on top of it
Right.
is not going to really be a big effect. So it would be surprising in at least some lakes if alum treatment is standard. And the data suggests that it's not a useful approach for us, which is too bad, because as you say, if
Yeah.
it would solve the problem, it'd be great to have a solution. But
Right.
but we're having to slog through with other approaches.
Yeah, and I think it really is dependent on the water body. We had 5 sediment samples taken of Lake Hennesacca, and it showed that our sediment is very rich in iron and manganese and phosphorus, and not so much on aluminum. But David Niels thinks that probably once every 5 years there's going to probably have to be a lake in New Hampshire that needs an alum treatment. But it's going to depend on the whole ecology of that lake. But for some lakes, there's probably going to be an investment of time and funds and expertise to do different types of, it could be rebuilding a road or rebuilding runoff from a road, or replacing septic systems. And it could be a lot of things that are going to be left to private landowners or private associations. And they may not have the resources to do that. But if there was funding available that would spare them 5 to 10 years of fundraising, where money they could access to be able to make those improvements. So every lake is going to be different. We were actually really disappointed when we got the results back, because we wish it was something that was just in our control.
Yeah.
We still have to do those things anyway, but it was really disheartening to realize even though we're doing all those things, we've got all this phosphorus coming up from the bottom. And there's other things too that legislatively we've been looking at. There hasn't been any success with them, but one is to just define wake boats. We have wake boats on Lake Hennesacca, and they generate a huge wake. And even though they could be 150 feet from shore by law, they still swamp the shores. We have jet skis that really aren't permitted on our lake, but they don't meet the statutory definition anymore. The statutory definition of a personalized watercraft is a single person watercraft. But jet skis now can have like 2 or more people on them, so they technically are exempt. So I know there's been colleagues of mine in the House that have been introduced bills to redefine those, to keep it up, but they just haven't been passed. In fact, one of the things I really suggest is, there's an election coming up in November. Make lake health and environmental issues an issue for people that are running in your district. And I applaud the people that got involved and wrote emails to 1066, but when we needed to get over the hump, I worked with New Hampshire Lakes to make sure people reached out to their representative, because you can reach out to the community as a whole, and that's okay, but we need to demand that our legislators, our representatives, are beholden to their voters, to their constituents, not to their party. And unless they hear from their constituents, it's very easy for them to just, take direction from their caucus or their party. So that needs to be a question. When people start campaigning and they want your vote, ask them what they think about cyanobacteria or growing DES's engagement in environmental issues. Because DES, by their definition, is a Department of Environmental Services. They're not a Department of Environmental Protection. They tend to respond to environmental problems, but they don't tend to be assertive or go out there to prevent them. And it's just the nature of their department. But I think if voters demand more commitment to environmental protection, it will happen. But it needs to come from the constituents.
I have
Yes.
a question. So is it the rising of the pH, is that what, when you talk about the aluminum adding, are you trying to lower the pH? Is that what the,
No, it would be really bad if we lowered the pH more than it is now.
but isn't that what that does?
No, the aluminum sulfate doesn't lower the pH, but it makes aluminum available to bond with phosphorus. So under low pH, low oxygen conditions.
Yeah.
So I know my husband asked a question, well, why can't you just bubble water in there, like have fountains to bring it? And I think they just said it's just temporary. You need.
It's hard to dilute
Right.
oxygen into the water.
And there's one of the remedies the state was looking at one point was copper sulfate, but that would present an issue because you're adding copper. Aluminum is more naturally occurring in sediment. You said I think you had a lot of aluminum here.
Yes.
So
we-
it
we have
is
free
natural in
aluminum.
some lakes. So it's pretty much just adding aluminum that may be found in other water bodies, adding it to ones that don't have enough to keep that phosphorus bound under those conditions. The other thing that affects our water in New Hampshire, and it's been going on for decades, is acid rain. Because when there was big activity in the Midwest with coal burning plants, all of the coal burning products would come over New England, and when it
Wouldn't that bring your
rains,
pH level up?
right, it lowered the pH.
Oh,
So
lowers pH.
we have like acid rain. It also dropped mercury. In fact, in New Hampshire, if you go to Fish and Game's website, DES may have it too. They have limits on how much fish you can eat that you caught from New Hampshire bodies because of the mercury level. Like I think a woman who's pregnant or a child is limited to, 2 4-ounce servings a month, something like that. So it's sad, it's sad that it's gotten like this. But, there are things we can do. So it's not something we're not at the point we just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do. There's stuff we can do. Anyway, so that law, so I'm going to put a bill in just to provide some funding that can be accessed so people don't have to wait until they raise the money to take action. Because like I said, waiting is not a good thing if you're experiencing chronic cyanobacteria blooms. The other bill that I'm considering, I'm going to meet with some people from Department of Transportation, is to set standards for private roads. So, for instance, let's say there's a private road that has shown, through a watershed management plan, has shown that the runoff is contributing, is into a water body, that private road association would have the responsibility of mitigating that, but that they could tap into that fund for money. But that's another big problem, because we have these private roads, and it's shown up in our watershed management plan and in others, where these private roads, which are, a lot of near water bodies are private roads, and they don't have the culvert system or the water runoff retention system to hold runoff. And so that goes right into the lake, and that's introducing phosphorus. So we need a way of addressing that too.
Is this fund a grant fund or a loan fund?
Well, I think it depends. I don't know for sure. I'm working with people on it, but in some situations it could be a loan fund, and but in some situations it's a fund where they forgive the principal, and you just pay. There is a similar fund in New Hampshire called the State Revolving Groundwater and Drinking Water. Groundwater and Drinking Water Revolving Fund, and that's how it operates. So if there's a situation, and it's typically if there's someone that has a private well or a group of homes on private wells that have been contaminated, they can apply to this fund for a loan, either for filtration or connecting to municipal water. And in many cases, that loan, the principal is forgiven if the project meets certain milestones. So I really don't know the specifics of that yet. I would really work with DES on that, and the Department of Revenue Administration on what that looks like. Did you have another question?
I had the same question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes.
Big picture wise, isn't tourism our number one revenue driver from here?
Yeah. In fact, what was really interesting is I think it was the Carnegie Institute did a study on Lake Winnipesaukee in that area, and found that it contributes $17 billion of value to the state. And so I actually had but just to tell you the mindset and why it's so important to connect with your state representatives, your state senator, is I had a bill. It was kind of like a minor bill, but one I introduced last year that would require people who are renting vacation or waterfront property to specify in the rental agreement, just a disclaimer, that water bodies throughout the world may be subject to fecal contamination or cyanobacteria blooms. Go to des.gov for current advisories. Just because I know at Kanasaka we were having a serious bloom, and there were children swimming in the water, and I went and I said, oh, we're having a bloom. This is, look at the water. This is why. And they were so angry because they had spent all this money to rent this place, and yet they can't go in the water. So I thought a disclaimer would be something. It wasn't one of the bills I really pushed. I just wanted to put it out there for awareness. But when I introduced the bill to the Environmental and Agriculture Committee of the House, one of the House members said, yeah, but wouldn't this be bad PR for us? Like, we don't want people to know. And I'm like, yeah, let's sacrifice health just so to keep our image.
Money talks.
Right.
No one ever listens to that.
Right. Yeah. So, yes.
How did you get your town involved to help with your watershed management plan? Was that is there a path that one can?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because we're not voters in Moulton Borough. Our permanent residence is in Merrimack. But what we did was, when we realized that we really wanted to get going on this watershed management plan, but it would take us about 3 years to raise that money, because we're a small association. So we said, well, let's do a petition warrant article, because Lake Kanasaka is fully within the boundaries of Moulton Borough. And I had learned from folks at Mary Meeting Lake, because they had done this, a few years before us, and they're in Alton Bay and New Durham. They had prepared a petition warrant article. So they just wrote this article. We request, X amount of dollars. In our case, it was like, we request $60,000 to help fund a watershed management plan for Lake Kanasaka. And you have to get 25 registered voters to sign it. We got like 100. And then we submitted that to the selectmen, and they did not recommend it. they felt like if you've got a problem with your lake, it's up to you. You know, one woman said there's not even a public beach on Lake Kennesaca. We have a public boat launch, but there's no beach. And the budget committee did not recommend it either. And so we went to the town meeting, and we had a bunch of people speak to it. There was a very respected veterinarian in town, people from the Conservation Commission, they spoke for it, and the selectmen reversed their decision. Not that they needed to, because it passed unanimously. The townspeople approved it. And we had a guy in town who had calculated that all of the waterfront waterfront properties contribute about $750,000 a year in property taxes. So if our value went down just 1%, it's going to make that 60,000 look like chump change. So, and people just knew it was the right thing to do. So that's how we got that money to fund it. And then there was a fellow, and we had raised money too. A lot of people donated money. There was also a fellow, Ted Hilton, who had run a camp, a summer camp for years and years. Very well-liked, well-respected man. And he passed away. And his family asked, in lieu of flowers, to make a contribution to the Lake Kennesaca Watershed Association, and that put us up over. And it actually, we had raised enough money that we were able to fund those sediment analysis. So DES came out and they took 5 core samples of the sediment. That gave us really a lot of important information. We also had money, the state also did, we didn't have to pay them, but they did a new bathymetric map, because it hadn't been done in years and years. So it showed that our lake isn't as deep as it used to be. And that's important information to have as well. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
path to follow along that line, I think.
Yeah, so the petition, if you want more, I can help you even prepare it. There's some, statutory language you have to have in it. It's nothing major, but whatever, are you in Warner?
Well, we're a Salisbury resident.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you just have to, towns have different schedule in town meeting. Usually it has to, well, it should say when you have to have petition warrant articles in.
Okay.
Yeah, but being prepared and having a lot of people support it. Like I said before, even local officials, if they're hearing from their constituents, they'll do the right thing. Like, there was no way the Board of Selectmen in Molten Borough was gonna walk out of that town meeting without approving that warrant article, because everybody was for it. They had to respond to their constituents.
Good point.
Any other questions? Okay. Good luck. Yeah.